Good morning, everyone. I just want to speak to you briefly about, or as briefly as I can get to 10 minutes, about development we've had within Police Scotland. And as Mr. Swinney had mentioned in his opening remarks, it's about trying to avoid traumatising and re-traumatising our people, and especially this relates to our young people. What I am going to speak to you about, though, is I wish I had had this 20 years ago, having had 20 years of operational experience and come into a department covering a national policy. That the work that's been done by my colleagues prior to my arrival is inspirational, and also work which I think makes a massive difference to policing and to the young people in particular that we're trying to serve. So if we could maybe move on, please, Laura. Thank you. So the background to the pilot, or to the project, this is a pilot that was developed which looks at essentially non-criminalising young people who are in care, and it's specifically about residential care. It starts out on the basis that 88% of children care are referred on care and protection grounds and not on criminality grounds. And that, for starters, is a massive stigma which we have to overcome, and a stereotype which is incorrectly developed over time, in terms of the perception being is that young people in care are there for criminal grounds. It couldn't be further from the truth. Research was carried out by the Centre for Youth and Criminal Justice, who identified that there was opportunities to develop practices around about avoiding the unnecessary criminalisation of children that are in care. And as a result of that, our colleagues developed one pilot in particular which is developed. So initially started out with a national policy, which was tested in Dumfries and Galloway between September of 2019 and February of 2020, and it continues today, and has since been moved into Greater Glasgow, into the urban environment, and it's running from September 2020 to the present day. If we can move on, please, Laura. So the foundations of this, as I've mentioned, the CYCJ report, the foundations of this, the whole approach that we took, was based around about tackling vulnerabilities and supporting vulnerable individuals. It was absolutely built around about our role as a corporate parent rather. The GovFIC principles clearly come in, and I'm conscious that they are currently being reviewed. And then United Nations Conventions on the Rights of a Child, which is extremely topical now, but has been about for some time. And finally, the care review, or as it's now known, the promise. And I'll come back to that later on. Thanks, Laura. So the approach was to develop a multi-agency approach, and we recognised that to be effective, there was no way we could have a standalone police-led initiative to tackle any kind of trauma. And as a result, we looked to our partners. Dumfries and Galloway developed the initial approach, which was based around about local authority, care providers, the Care Commission, and other private partners who came in to support. Really important that we developed the whole approach to care, and there was two elements to the test. First one was around about children missing from care protocol, which I will come back to, and also the second part, and the most fundamental part, was about non-criminalisation of children in care. So we looked to Dumfries and Galloway to deliver that in the first instance. Essentially what it did was test a protocol to look at avoiding criminalising young people. So we can move on, Laura. So the strategic group was set up, and training was fundamental. We were introducing a new approach here, which, while not complicated, was a significant challenge against long-term practice, especially from policing. And we had to look at the training practice. It was the training that was put in for that. We've taken two different approaches. In Dumfries and Galloway, the training was done in a multi-agency environment. It lasted one full day, and it looked at a whole variety of training inputs, ranging from talking about the specific protocol, but fundamentally also giving an overview on trauma and brain development. And that was delivered by our colleague Lynn Sweeney from Fire and Rescue, who I think is maybe online today. And Lynn gave inspirational inputs to the team, which met the needs of all. But what it did show us was there was different needs between policing and social work and care staff, especially when it came to an awareness of trauma. When we moved it into the Glasgow approach, we then started to look at how we could condense it slightly, and we went to a half-day approach, which contained very similar information, but also was more condensed. And clearly we've got a significant challenge just now with COVID, because up to now the training has all been done in a single room. But in terms of the pilot, what was very important was there was significant support available. Significant support available to the young people that we're working with, to care providers, but also to police officers and social work staff who were stepping out beyond a comfort zone to deliver something that was slightly different, all in the benefit of young people. The evaluation, though, was going to be critical because we were testing a pilot to look at a national change, and what this effectively meant was, in a wider sense, when police are recording crime, all crimes reported to the police must be recorded as a crime. We were stepping away slightly from that because we were not necessarily always recording a crime when it was reported, as long as it took place within a care setting and within the care home itself. Laura, please. So I touched on the training itself was multidiscipline. I think what it did instill was it looked at the whole approach as being adoptive of a trauma-informed approach, but also when it came to the non-criminalisation and also the missing protocol, it was about individual practices, which then became trauma-informed as well. So we had the overall strategic approach was very much trauma-informed, but also the individual practices mirrored that. And in terms of the missing protocol, what that related to was previously, if a child was reported missing from a care setting, police would be deployed, we would commence a missing person inquiry and then follow that through. That was a lot of the time leading to unnecessary attendance of police officers in a care setting because the risk it could be an opportunity to manage that risk slightly different. And as a result, a lot of the responsibility and risk was passed back to care staff through consultation and agreement, and that in the end has benefited both the young people, the care providers and the police. Ultimately though, reduce our footprint and reduce the trauma that police officers can cause when engaging with young people where it's unnecessary. And move on please, Laura. So the evaluation was done. It was done by the Centre for Youth and Criminal Justice, which was going to give us, what we set out at the outset was we're looking for quantitative data. So you need to excuse me while I try and think that one through. Quantitative data as opposed to necessarily qualitative. It primarily looked at the training element, but then we looked at the secondary impacts as well. So continue on, Laura. So that's some of the outcomes that we got. So in the Dumfries and Galloway pilot, what we have seen is a very similar trend developing in Glasgow in terms of the outcomes from there. But while I set out to say, first of all, we were looking at quantitative, there is no question that the qualitative outcomes from this have been far greater than the numbers. However, you can see there that the actual attendance at incidents was cut by 56%, that recorded crimes went down from 90 to 38, and the instances of reported missing people from 74 to 43, all to reduce the unnecessary criminalisation or contact between police and young people to try and avoid re-traumatising and having impacts on their longer term. So continue on, Laura. However, the qualitative outcomes, as I can see that now, were slightly more interesting, and I think have been far greater in terms of the impact. The trust that has developed between police and the young people, and also between police and care providers, has been exceptional. I think that there is now a far greater relationship between all parties concerned, which ultimately is about providing care to vulnerable young people. There has been significant empowerment of our staff, both police officers and care staff, to make decisions and to make the right decisions based on the needs of a child and the proper knowledge of the child. But above all else, we've got a belief in an approach and in a joint approach, which is critical to achieving what we want to try and do in supporting young people. Continue on, please, Laura. So in terms of the learning that we've taken from it, clearly governance always comes into it, and it's about making sure that we are comfortable with decisions that are taken. Are we managing the risk? Because at the end of the day, there's still significant risk in terms of managing the vulnerable young people, but the governance processes have been put in place and quality assurance checks applied against that. So we're happy and content that there is no additional risk being exposed to young people as a result of reducing police input in their lives and their involvement. Liaison officers have been appointed by police, which has been really, really important because it's allowed officers to go into the care establishments, build up relationships with young people when they are not there to deal with an ongoing or a previous incident, and they can actually build up that trust, which is so critical. The relationships I've talked about, I think that's been one of the biggest things which has come out of it. We have a much greater, better relationship with key staff between both police and care staff and social work staff who are responsible for wider care, to make sure that we can take appropriate interventions and share information appropriately. And finally, I think we've actually found the so what, and what we always start out with a pilot is, well, so what, and so what is going to be the outcome. And I think we have absolutely nailed it with this. This is an approach which I think has led to a whole different practice being adopted across Scotland, or it will be across Scotland in time, and we'll look to try and develop further as we make our way through things. But I think in terms of the so what, this is one of the things that I so wish I had 20 years ago as a tactic and an opportunity for me to take a different approach. And continue on, Laura. So the next steps, as I say, we're running the pilot in Greater Glasgow just now. My hope is that we will continue that until around August, when we will be re-evaluated with a view to presenting that back to the government, with a view to adopting, hopefully, the pilot protocol for the non-criminalisation, which I think will go a long, long way to reducing the trauma in individuals. The strategic drivers there are growing, and I mentioned earlier on about UNCRC and the promise, both massive bits of work coming to us in terms of supporting children and young people and protecting their rights. So I think this project also cuts well into that and reflects really well on trauma approaches. There is no question, and everyone mentions it and everyone has to mention it, but the impact of COVID. We will have some degree of challenges taking it forward, because we will be restricted in terms of being able to deliver in the room multi-agency training, which is so fundamental to it all. But I think the long term is we should see an adoption of the policy, hopefully across the country, and ultimately an overall gain for our young people. My own lesson from this has been, and having reflected back on the last 20 years, this is not a massive change for us, but the benefits have been substantial. So my plea to you all would be, when looking at trauma-based approaches, is to think differently and challenge the practices, because it doesn't take much to make a massive difference. And back to you, Kate.